joining. Yes, thank you very much for joining. Last week when we were discussing the social and economic networks in Africa, I think we were basically trying to see how there was life on the African continent before the European advent, and then how Africans had interacted with other parts of the world before the European advent, so that we don't create the impression as if Africa was an isolated continent, and then there was nothing happening until the Europeans breathed life into the continent from the 15th century. Today, we are going to look at a similar aspect of the same argument, where we will look at the emergence of early states in Africa. The aim or the objective is almost the same as that of last week. You know, even at a point when Africans were asking for independence in the 20th century, there were hesitations, and I'm talking about hesitations that argued that African states were being mentored to be able to govern themselves. So if they left Africa abruptly, it is going to create chaos. So that process of mentoring Africa to be able to govern themselves was not complete. And because of that, some European countries in Africa had to hesitate for 5 to 10 years and even more before they granted independence to their former colonies. So today we are trying to look at how these early states highlighted very high level and sophisticated forms of governance that suited the African political communities or states in a manner that will let us not create the impression as if Africa did not know how to govern until they were exposed to a Europeans' way of doing same. Please, is there any question you want to ask me about this introductory comment?
Yes, Doc, I have a question about the reading material.
Okay.
I could find 2 books that were sent to us.
Okay.
The one is about Africa to 1875, and the other one is actually no, sorry. The one that is a book, that's A History of Africa from 1995. That book was there. The other one, Africa to 1875, that's an abstract. So I couldn't read from that book. We couldn't read from that book.
Mm.
And then I also realized that the pages that were mentioned was, I think what we were supposed to read from A History of Africa 1995 was page 336 to 357, because it starts exactly there with the Ghana Empire. So I think that was a little mistake on the sheet.
Okay. Yes. I get that challenge. Honestly, the librarian just tried to put something together, not necessarily strictly responding to what was on my course outline, but to get a material that if you are constrained by circumstances not to find any other thing anywhere to read, you can rely on. So it is not a perfect match.
Okay.
Because like I told you, I don't usually have this soft copy to share with the students. If the students go to the library to access this information themselves. So this is the first time that I suggested to him, and then he volunteered, and then he could not give me the assurance that he will be able to scan all those pages for me, but he will be able to find materials that matched what I have put on my course outline that are similar, so that it can help some of you.
Yes,
So
yes.
I understand the imperfection associated with the material, so far as the course outline is concerned.
Yes, that's clear. So I actually, personally, I also used another Africa history book.
God bless you.
Yeah, from Molefe Kete Asante.
Okay.
I don't know if you know that book. That was also, yeah, useful, but not with every topic. Yeah.
Okay. 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 So I get that sense of imperfection. Yes, but like I told you on the first day, I expect that you should get other materials that treat similar topics, or get other materials, even if they are not books. If they are articles that treat the topics, if they are book chapters that treat the topic, just try and then read them. Maybe going forward, if we want to continue to do what we are doing, I should take my time to scan what I have here and then put them into week 1, week 2, week 3 in folders like that. So that immediately you take this topic, you know you have to open week 1 folder.
Yes, that would be very helpful, but I know it would be a lot of work for you if you have time for that. Yeah.
Yes. That is, if this thing is going to be sustained, then in the long term, that is what I'll seek to do.
Yes, Doc. That sounds like a great idea.
All right. Yeah. So aside from that, we want to look at the political developments in Africa that led to the emergence of states. And I also put a message on your platform that if it were possible, just try and expose yourself to some of these ancient states in Africa. Please, were you able to do that?
Yeah, I was able to do that. I don't know about the other students.
Okay.
They can speak for themselves.
Great.
Yeah, I had an opportunity to go through some of the material and look at the early states also.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yes. So I want to look at what is political development, and is so that it will lead us to how Africa developed its political institutions to the highest levels before the European influx. And I told you the main objective is to disabuse our minds of the fact that Africa could not govern themselves, or were not capable of political administration of any sort, until they were exposed to the Europeans, who started teaching them. And then Africa had to wait to be taught to an extent before they could be granted independence. So political development is just a conscious effort by any group of people or any society to formulate policies that will influence society's organization. Like, you formulate policies that will help you organize society in a more coherent and efficient manner. Why do you have to do this? Because human development naturally will lead to high population, and as the population become high, you need to organize it in a manner that there won't be chaos. So when I talk about political development, I'm not trying to speak any syllabus or academic language. I'm just trying to talk about how society is compelled, under the circumstance of high population and complex society, to formulate policies that will help to regulate how individuals and institutions will make society more fluid and habitable. So how do we then trace the evolution of African societies to what we are trying to talk about, the political development that we are seeking to talk about. So African society, like any other society elsewhere, began with hunters and gatherers. You know, if the population is not high, people move about feeding from wild animals and wild fruits. And as and when they were becoming scarce at any location, they moved to the next location. But as population increased and then human technology also improved, people settled and then started developing simple technology to manipulate the environment to still survive. That is, keep animals and then cultivate food so that you can survive. So human society, and like that of Africa, will usually move from hunters and gatherers to permanent settlements. Then these permanent settlements will develop into what sociologists or anthropologists call simple non-centralized political systems. This is what you find in some literature to be acephalous, but I think that is a misnomer of a term to use, acephalous. To say the society is acephalous is like saying that it has no head. But non-centralized societies have heads, but authority is not centralized under one single unit or person. So there are so many heads within the society, but they haven't unified that in one person to give authority to that person yet. So the development of simple non-centralized political systems. Maybe when we come to the discussions, I will try and explain this one further, because there are some parts of Africa where this natural metamorphosis from simple non-centralized political systems was either disrupted by indigenous African settlers who were also migrating from African sophisticated societies in terms of politics, who came and established centralized authority over these non-centralized groups, or some of these non-centralized political states were given artificial leaders by the European colonial administration, who in certain countries decided to rule indirectly through traditional rulers. So when they go to the society and there is no centralized authority under one traditional ruler, they create one. And when they left, this thing has created conflicts in some African countries, because the political leaders who the British or the French or the Portuguese or the German colonial administration might have given to the people do not have the royal legitimacy to be political rulers. So as society developed after colonialism, those who have the royal legitimacy will start asserting themselves. And I have termed this phenomenon in one of my papers as indigenous settler divides, where those who were given political authority artificially, I'm using artificially reservedly, are being competed for this political authority by the original or royal households, who believe that, but for this interruption, the natural metamorphosis would have meant that they would become the traditional rulers. So society develops from hunters and gatherers to permanent settlements, and then non-centralized political systems, and then eventually get to the most advanced, which we call the complex political system. But before we talk about the features of these complex political systems, because I'm sure as I am talking about political systems in Africa about 500 years, 1,000 and over years ago, you'll be wondering what will characterize this type of political system. So before we talk about the features of these political states that emerged in Africa in ancient times, I want us to now talk about some of the states that you found in your reading. So what are some of the political states that you found in your readings in Africa here that predates the 15th century that we can give as examples so that we'll use them as case studies to talk about the features of these complex political systems that we claim developed in Africa before the European advent. Please, are you there?
Yes, we are there.
Okay.
So the Ghana Empire, of course, the Songhai Empire, I don't know if I pronounced it correctly, the Kanem Bornu Empire.
Yeah.
Mali, and then we have Mewene Mutapa. That was more like a big stone town, a town made of stones with a stone wall. That was in Zimbabwe, and then we have Congo and Zulu.
Okay. The Zulu kingdom.
Yeah.
Okay. Before it became significant, it was a very small state until Shaka came to the scene in the 19th century. I think the Zulu polity was not a kingdom. That's why I wanted us to take our time and then try to decipher this by excluding those that do not predate the 15th century, even though they were greater states that emerged after the 15th century, so that we don't create an erroneous impression.
But then, Doc, I have a question then. What is then the difference between an empire and a kingdom? Is there a difference, or because also these words are being used interchangeable?
Yes, there is a slight difference. A kingdom is a smaller version of an empire. So, for instance, if we are talking about the British Empire, please, are you with me?
Yes, I'm here. I don't know.
Good.
The others,
Good.
they can also.
So, it's like talking about the difference between a state and a nation. Let me use that analogy to explain an empire and a kingdom. But before I even do that, the Zulu state or polity, not even a state, the Zulu polity was not even a kingdom. It was not even a kingdom before the 19th century. It was a very small political polity, or it was a very small political space, a very small community until Shaka expanded it. But let me come back to the main point. It's like asking what is the difference between a nation and a state. Sometimes a state is a nation, but it is not all the time that a state will be a nation. So a state has certain features that makes it a state. And it includes sovereign boundaries with a leader and so on and so forth. But you see, when we say a nation, that means the people are culturally homogeneous. So you see, we can have a state that is not necessarily a nation. So in that sense, we may say a nation is sometimes, not all the time, is sometimes a subset of a state. But when you have a state whose people are culturally homogeneous, then we say it is a nation state. Let's move away from that point. I just want to use this analogy to explain the empire. Empire and a kingdom. A kingdom is like a subset of a kingdom. So Britain, comprising of England, Scotland, Wales, is already a kingdom. But you see, it expanded to be an empire when it acquired places in Australia, in America, in Africa, in Asia. So if you are talking about the British Empire, you are talking about a larger space than maybe the British Kingdom. So there is no strict dichotomy that this thing here cannot be a kingdom, or no, it cannot be an empire. It has to be a kingdom. But you see, if you want to make the difference, you can always make a difference. So sometimes we use it interchangeably because, for instance, if you are in Ghana and you've heard about the greatness of Asante, then Asante said they expanded to modern day Togo and then Cote d'Ivoire. And so it is Asante Empire. And somebody will say, oh, it's just a kingdom. So these are things that are not so strict in terms of dichotomy, but literally, when somebody mentions a kingdom, your mind races to a point where you are looking at a relatively larger space than a kingdom. When somebody say an empire, you are tempted to think it's a relatively larger space than a kingdom. But it doesn't necessarily mean that a kingdom is not an empire or an empire is not a kingdom. You use the term interchangeably. But if you want to go in the strict sense, an empire will always be larger than a kingdom.
Yeah, I remember from my European history lessons that in the 19th century, multiple German kingdoms and duchies came together, and then they created the German Empire because they bonded, and on the top of it was Kaiser Wilhelm. So they changed also the name of the one who's ruling the empire. In this case,
yeah, like the Austro-Hungary Empire.
Correct. And then
that is made up of.
Yes, and within that empire, you still had princes, kings, everything, and also they ruled their own region.
Kingdoms.
Yes, correct. So that's something I remember from the distinction from European history lessons. But yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Ali.
Yes,
then
please.
I also have an additional question. Could it be that when we used to use the word kingdom, it was actually to determine a homogeneous group of people who are living in one particular state, and later on during the modern years, we started using the word nation. So could nation be the new word for what we used to use during the pre-modern days, during the pre-modern years, for kingdom?
No, please.
Oh,
Kingdoms are not necessarily homogeneous. In fact, kingdoms are rather very heterogeneous.
okay.
So it is not a substitute for a nation at all.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay, so thank you very much. Can the rest of us talk about some of the states that we found in Africa that predates European influx in the 15th century?
Think that could read something about how the Portuguese they encountered in Benin an organized political system they want to could trade with, etc. So yeah, I would call them also I call it a polity or a nation or whatever you call it, whatever term you like to use. I would say
Benin.
a nation in Benin and also
Okay.
the Congo region, etc. And in what now is Angola, I think they encountered different rulers and political systems there.
Okay. Okay. Please, can I hear from another person or I can go on?
I think
Okay, so these states in Africa, including some of the very ancient ones like the Pharaonic civilization. Did you mention Axum, Ethiopia? They were characterized by centralization of authority. So in all these states or kingdoms, you found somebody who was accepted as the head of all the other subheads. So that is what we mean by centralization of authority. And that is very different from the previous thing where I was talking about simple non-centralized political systems. So in the simple non-centralized political systems, authority lies with different heads of units like lineages or clans or even families. But when these people come together to allow one person to take overall authority, we call it centralization of authority. And in African states, there was centralization of authority among those states that you have mentioned. There was also a hierarchy of authority where below the head, there are subheads, and then it goes like that to the very basic units. So maybe the emperor, then the kings, then below the kings are village or town heads, and then below the town heads or village heads are the family heads. So there is this hierarchy of authority. And then there are formal rules and regulations. Even though these were not necessarily written, there were rules and regulations that were made to guide how people behaved and how institutions regulated human behavior. There were well-structured tax system that was not necessarily paid in currency, but in other forms. There was a potential for these empires or states to always increase in authority. So these states that we are mentioning are not states that will just be there for a very long time, because they were constantly very conscious about increasing their size so that they can continue to influence the areas. Because once you don't increase in size, you are likely to be submerged by an emerging state or empire. So there's always a potential to increase in size. In Africa, these are some of the factors that led to the development of these states. So states that had these complex systems that we are discussing were located in strategic areas so that they took advantage of those areas, such as maybe the presence of natural resources or strategic locations that gave them access to trade routes where they took taxes from the people who engaged in these taxes. So yeah, I've already mentioned natural resources. They had natural resources. There are leaders who made them big, were ingenious, like people, all these states, you always associate one very great leader who established the destiny. Although I said, so that's why I was talking about the Zulu kingdom. The Zulu community or society or polity has always
Dr. Ali, I don't know if you're still talking because we can't hear you anymore. Dr. Ali, your speech ended abruptly. I don't know if you can hear us or is something wrong with the microphone. Ah, we've lost him.
That in Africa, there were two major reasons that led to the development of states: natural resources and then trade. And then all these two had to be utilized by an ingenious leader or leaders at a point in time. So I want to discuss how trade facilitated the development of states that in Africa, that emerged in Africa in the pre-European era. The desire to control these trade routes, like states that wanted to take advantage of the trading activities that was going on, will strive to be strong so that they will be controlling the trade routes by taking taxes from the people involved in the trade. Then there's also the desire to control natural resources in areas so that they can be the controllers of the commodities of trade. Then there is also the desire to control taxation. That is, if you have the power, you determine how much tax that will be paid. Although Said in the East African coast is a 19th century phenomenon. I will just make an example by saying that when Said relocated from the Mediterranean region to establish Oman, the capital of Oman in Zanzibar, in the East African coast, his major preoccupation was to build an economic empire that transcended Oman boundaries and then the Mediterranean boundaries into Africa. So he was he employed financiers from India who came and invested in the caravans that was controlled by the Arabs into the interior of East Africa. And then what happened was that when these caravans moved from the coast of East Africa into the interior regions started fighting for superiority in that region so that they will control the resources that was needful by the Arab caravans that came from the coast, and also take taxes from the traders who came to transact business. So there's always the desire to control taxation or take tax. And then one of the things that came with the early trade was Islam, because most of the external people who traded with the Africans were Arabs, and they came with the Islamic religion. And the Islamic religion brought literacy that facilitated the administration in the palaces in African states. And that's the reason why even up to date, you still find Arabic clerics in most African indigenous states' palaces. The introduction of the camel and the horses also facilitated settlers. I'm talking about indigenous people who migrated from maybe their superior political locations to spaces where the people were non-centralized. They dominated the people and established larger centralized political administration because they went into set warfares with advanced technology that was facilitated by the use of the camel and the horses. So an example is the establishment of Dagon, Mampurugu, and Nanu around the 14th century. In the 1300s, these states were established by migrants from Burkina Faso and beyond who came to northern Ghana because of the use of camel, the horses, and other superior weaponry. They were able to establish these notable kingdoms in northern Ghana. In conclusion, it can be said that what led to the development of larger states in Africa was that the people naturally responded to the pressure that was brought about as a result of these trading activities. So once they were happening, it propelled most of the states to rise up to the occasion and then take advantage of the benefits that came as a result of these trading activities. Okay, so we can go on the break so that when we return and you have questions, we can have discussions about this. Otherwise, I will talk about European advent and commerce in Africa.
Yes, Doc, thank you very much. Let's have a 10-minute break.
All right. Okay, I think you can see my slides again.
Yes, we have a few. You can see it.
Okay, is there something that we need to talk about before I continue with European advent and commerce?
Yeah, there's a quick question I had about the development of states, because yeah, I understand you say, especially when there's economic activity or tax related things that people like to organize. So I also thought, like, yes, they also probably organize for reasons of defending their territory or the resources or the trade routes. So it's also a reason to start advanced organization within city-states or polities. So when there's always then growing, when an empire or a nation is growing, there's often warfare involved. But the records of these warfares, are they documented, or is it just oral history? Because like the document about state affairs, because we remember the hieroglyphs from the Egypts. Aksum was documenting things. In Nubia, I think there was also written history. But the other regions, like the Songhai, Songhai probably had Arabic script recording also the warfare. But then the other regions we mentioned before, like Benin and in Congo and in Angola, are there any written records of warfare while developing or growing the empires?
Thank you. Like written records of the exploits of the development of those states. Like, are you asking whether we have documented evidence?
Yes, correct. Yes, correct. Because like you mentioned, of course, often they have to organize and also protect trade routes or any other commerce activity or resources. So that's how empires often grow by or defending regions or conquering other regions for these resources. So I can see that happening in the Savannah region, because sometimes there are, especially when the, how do you call it, the Muslim clerics were also writing things down. But there's a bigger part of the continent where also empires have came up, were established, grown. What type of historic evidence do we have there?
Honestly, apart from the earliest forms of writings that were associated with earliest civilizations, such as the hieroglyphics that you mentioned, all the other forms of writings came from Arabic literacy. And then where states were not associated with this Arabic literacy in any way, but still emerged, we can only talk about other sources of information that include oral history, but not necessarily written records, because apart from the ancient forms of writings that were developed in very, very earlier civilizations that dates about 5,000 years and more, the only notable form of writing came with the Arabic clerics. And that is why they were very well sought after in most African indigenous states that were emerging. So sometimes, even if they were not directly involved in the trade and they found themselves in the spaces, they were co-opted into the palaces to provide these clerical services in terms of documenting their history.
Yeah, I know it's a different topic altogether about the scripts and the different languages, but it's very, because yeah, of course, like you said, there was a script in the Nile region, the River Nile, and also Nubia used the script. I think in Ethiopia, Aksum, they also did writing early versions of a Bible in Aramaic or some other scripts, but it never then like how you call it went across those regions into other regions in on the continent. So the practice of writing and recording history on paper or stone or whatever.
You see, we don't have records of maybe Aramaic or maybe hieroglyphics transcending from the boundaries of those spaces into other spaces like the savannah, because what was going to bring the interaction? You see, if there is no activity between the people, it doesn't get them together to transfer writing knowledge or the writing literacy into those spaces. But you see, Arabic is very prominent because it came with Islam, it came with the desire to propagate the gospel, and it came with the desire to also engage in trading activities. So that one spread across different regions in Africa, more than the earliest forms of writings that emerged in Africa in classical or ancient times.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Hello, please, are you there?
Oh, yeah, yes, thank you. I was already on mute, but yes, thank you for this additional information in the answer.
All right, thank you. Is there any other comments? Or I can move on to the advent of Europeans in Africa and how that started with commercial activities in various facets, from the trade in legitimate goods such as gold and ivory that evolved into slave trade, and then the motives for the abolition of the slave trade towards the beginning of the 19th century. Can I go on with that?
Yes, you can, Doc.
Okay, so the Middle Ages in Europe, you know, when we say the Middle Ages, it's purely an European phenomenon. It's trying to speak about our history with somewhat an European lens, because in Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world, if you say Middle Ages, it doesn't mean anything to them. But in European history, when you say Middle Ages, it refers to the period between the end of the classical European civilizations that was occasioned by the last major European ancient empire, the Roman Empire, and then the beginning of the Renaissance, where the people who lived during the Renaissance claimed that nothing significant of note happened within that period. And then the Renaissance was a rebirth of the classical civilization that ended around the 5th century AD in Europe. So between that 5th century AD and then the 13th, 14th, 15th century, where the Renaissance happened in Europe, like nothing happened. So those Middle Ages, about 1,000 years, was characterized by the Crusades, because the Crusades in itself also happened around the 11th century AD and then the 12th century AD. So when I ask when was the Middle Ages, I'm simply talking about the period between the last classical European civilization or ancient European civilization, that is the Roman civilization, and the beginning of the Renaissance. And when I talk about the Crusades, I'm talking about the religious wars between Muslims and Christians around the 1090s AD. That occasioned Christians and Muslims fighting for religious dominance or superiority, if you like. So as a result of these crusades during the Middle Ages, Portugal and Spain, which are European countries, came under Islamic domination. By the 15th century, however, both Portugal and Spain had gained at least partial independence from the Muslims. So by the 15th century, when they gained partial independence, Portugal in 1415 occupied Ceuta, which is in modern Morocco, as part of the struggle for religious dominance. So Portugal, which had freed itself to a very large extent from the Moors, the Muslims, also moved a step further to occupy an Islamic-dominated area in Morocco, Ceuta, in 1415. So their occupation of Ceuta in Morocco exposed them to mineral wealth, particularly gold. And then conversation about the source of this gold proved that it was further to the interior of North Africa, and the gold was brought to Ceuta in Morocco as a result of the trans-Saharan trade. So it whet the appetite of the Europeans to explore further, to get the source of this very precious wealth. But on that note, can I pause here to ask what you think are the inspiration for Europeans, particularly the Portuguese, to spearhead the exploration of the African coast in the 15th century? What do you think are the motivations for European explorers, or particularly the Portuguese explorers who spearheaded the exploration of the African coast?
I think, like you mentioned, trade is a very important directive for these people, of course, and they could see with their own eyes that the goods that were available to the Moors, and probably also the story of how do you call him, Mansa Musa, who was also throwing gold around, made them very curious where all the gold came from.
Okay.
Definitely, I think trade.
Yeah, so
very important.
the trade that exposed the mineral resources of Africa via the trans-Saharan trade, and then Mansa Musa also displaying mineral wealth, led to European curiosity to find the source of this mineral wealth. Thank you.
Doc.
Yes, please.
Can I add something to that? Because
yes, please.
One of the reasons why they want to, of course, prosper in their trade is also to win the competition in Europe. I mean, in order to, you know, not only be prosperous, but also be able to compete with the other European kingdoms and states. You have to be strong, your military, you have to be strong. And that was, I think, also a reason, because they were fighting, they were in war constantly with each other. So every state, every kingdom is trying to be bigger than the other or stronger than the other. So I also think that's an important incentive to go and explore other parts of the world where they could take resources.
Thank you so much. So to try and then build or enhance your power by seeking opportunities outside Europe in order to compete healthily, to compete with other European states, or to dominate in that region. Thank you. Is there any other reason you think inspired the Europeans to explore the African continent? Hello, or I can go on.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so they wanted to have access to this sub-Saharan trade directly. They wanted to find an alternative route to their possessions in the Far East. They wanted to control parts of the fertile regions of the African continent for agricultural purposes. And, you know, as part of the Crusades, they wanted to win the African continent, which was very well marauded by the Arabic world, and then compete with them and win Africa for Christ so that they will score points in the Crusades. And then, of course, the discovery of large quantities of gold after the fall of Ceuta, when they dominated Ceuta, they got first-hand information. What Mansa Musa was displaying was a remote evidence. But when they occupied Ceuta, they got first-hand information about the mineral wealth that was on the African continent. So as a result of this, the King of Portugal had to secure permission from the Pope in 1418 to come to Africa. Please, why did the King of Portugal have to secure permission from the Pope? Why? Why the Pope?
Because they fell under, Portugal was one of the Catholic states in Europe, and they fell under the dominance of the Pope in Rome. Political, especially during that time, state and religion was very much tied to each other. And when you have the support of the Pope, the support of the Vatican, then you would also probably have resources.
Thank you. So, especially during the Middle Ages, before the Reformation, the church controlled every aspect of European life, social, economic, and political. So it was after the Reformation that this thing was waning gradually. But even then, by the 15th century, by the 15th century, where we are talking about, before the Reformation, the Pope controlled the whole of Europe, not just Portugal. And if you wanted to undertake such a huge venture, you needed the papal permission to move into Africa. And then they particularly encouraged the Pope that they were striving to know Africa so that they can win it for Christ. And that directly fell under the purview of the church. They will be interested in that. So by 1434, they had rounded up the Cape of Bajador, and by the end of the 15th century, virtually the whole of the African coast, the transatlantic coast of Africa had been seen, settled by various European powers. It was from 1456 that the Portuguese started signing treaties of peaceful trade with the local people. So once they settled, it is not like European presence meant European domination. What they started by signing peaceful treaties, they started by agreeing with the local people on the terms of trade. And the most important thing I have highlighted red is that before the development of before the Industrial Revolution, Africans traded on equal terms with Europeans. So before the peak of the Industrial Revolution around 1850, Africans were trading on equal terms with the Europeans. So why did this trade relationship that was among equals now turned into a situation where one group determined the price? Why do you think this situation changed gradually from the period of the Industrial Revolution up to the present? Please, are we there?
Yes, but I think it's a difficult question. Why it changed? Yes.
Why did this trade relationship? The clue is it started changing from the period of the Industrial Revolution.
So yeah, I think then say it like that. So in the whole thinking of I call it global enterprise, because the Europeans they had the ships that were trading between also Asia, Africa, and the Americas. There came how do you call it a division of activities, and Africa became only used for resources. So first people, then also later on minerals or agriculture. So they came in a very much different position compared to trading on equal terms before. I think that could have been one of the reasons why
Exactly.
they were not in control of the whole, how do you call it?
Yeah, exactly. You see, industrialization peaked in Europe in the second half of the 19th century, although it started at the beginning of the 1800s or a little bit earlier than that. It peaked by the second half of the 19th century, from the 1850s. And Britain, who spearheaded this industrial revolution, was beginning to get competition from other European countries that had also become largely industrialized. And as Europe started to close its markets to its neighbors, they needed to seek alternative places to send their finished or the products that were made as a result of the industrial revolution. And Africa became that grounds where, you see, so it occasioned the period where slaves were becoming less profitable because work that human beings would do, several human beings could do, now machines had taken over. So there was the gradual waning of interest for slave labor that was also further enhanced by the interest to keep Africans in Africa so that Africans can produce the raw materials that were desired by these industrialized nations. Apart from production of raw materials, Africans in Africa were supposed to also be available to provide markets as consumers of the finished products. So if you notice, Europeans had been on the coast of Africa for about 400 years, but colonialism began towards the end of the 19th century. So you see, when it got to a point where Europe needed Africans to stay in Africa to produce raw materials and then to stay in Africa to provide market for finished products, it occasioned the period where slave labor was not too needful. Then there was the need to practically take steps to end slavery and slave trade from source. And then it triggered proper colonial administration of territories. So you no more stay on the coast of Africa and trade with the people, but you need to provide political structures that will enable you stop slave trade from source, that will enable you provide the markets for European finished goods, that will enable you make African producers of cash crops, raw materials that were desired in European industries. So once this platform was set, Africa now became producers of raw materials. Then they buy the raw materials at a price that they found fit, and then they use the raw material to produce finished goods, and then they determine the price that they found fit. So it's no more like exchanging one thing for another like it used to be, like exchanging maybe ivory for textiles or something like that. But now they make sure that they took raw materials at a price that they determined, and then they produce the finished goods, and then they determine the price that they wanted to sell to you. So adding value to the products now determine the price difference.
But
So,
Professor, during the period of the transatlantic slave trade, the European nations, they got during that trade period so much more richer compared to the African nations who were involved in the human trade, that always it seems like that during any type of global trade system, Africa got the short end of the stick, because if you look the type of wealth that has been built in the European metropoles, also during the 200-300 years of transatlantic slave trade, they were also only deliverers of resources.
sorry, I'm so sorry. The line was not too clear from here. So if you can just summarize what you have said so far so that you continue.
Oh yeah, I have now a very, there's like a huge rainstorm coming down in Amsterdam. So maybe that's the reason why I had some troubles with the line. I hope it's better now.
Yeah, it's very fine.
Yeah, because I was saying, even during the period of the transatlantic slave trade, it feels like the African nations who were involved in this trade also got actually the short end of the stick. If you look at the huge wealth which has come into Europe, also with all the metropoles, and also how they have been able to build their industries, art form, and academics, that also not only during the industrialization period, but even the 100 years before that, how do you call it? It was not actually trading on equal terms. If you see that one party becomes extremely rich and the other party does benefit, but does not get the same type of richness from that type of trade. So I think the way the trading was working from this, actually for me, maybe already from the 16th century until later, always the Europeans were on top and only used the African countries for resources, in the beginning people, and the finished products were or sold back to the African countries or they were sold back further on into Europe. So it's like a continuous way of dealing with each other. I hope this was better. Still raining enormously in Amsterdam.
No, the line is very clear, very, very clear. So I heard you clearly, please.
No,
Can
that
you
was
hear
my,
me?
that was my, yeah, that was my only remark. That's my remark, like the unequal trading partnership
precedes,
has been there in a long time already.
Okay, precedes the, okay. And then you particularly use the transatlantic slave trade as an example where maybe persons or human beings were exchanged for relatively less valuable things from Europe. Is that not the case?
No, yeah, but because in the end of the trade, the human beings who were brought to the Americas and the Caribbean, they produced also new material that actually were processed later on in the European factories and then sold again with a huge profit. And sometimes if they created clothing or other stuff, that also was also then used for trading again with the African
Africans.
nations. Yeah.
So honestly, you know, preceding this transatlantic slave trade too was trade in legitimate goods between the two parties, isn't it? So before the transatlantic slave trade, the Europeans and Africans traded in legitimate goods such as ivory, gold from Africa, and to some extent, some slaves who were sent to other European possessions, but not the New World.
Yes, yes.
Are you saying that even that trade too was unequal, or it is just the transatlantic slave trade that you found unequal?
Yes, I think initially when you just trade goods for goods and that's it, that sounds like on equal terms. But when
goods for human beings.
Yeah, so when that starts, that was also like relatively equal terms. But at some point, when they changed the global economic system, that they used that they created that they used the goods that they got from the Americas to produce new other things in Europe, clothing, I call it sugar, etc., sugar refineries, etc.
Yeah,
then the global capitalistic system sets in, and then the Africans got the short end of the stick within this global capitalistic system.
Exactly. It is so difficult for anyone to disagree with you, because it will be very difficult to say that anything that was exchanged for human beings is equally valued. Yes, so I will agree with you that before the industrialization, even the exchange of any other product for human beings was unequal. Yes, I will agree with you. But I was just trying to make the point that so far as the trade in legitimate goods was concerned and preceded the transatlantic slave trade, and then also preceded when Europeans took raw materials from Africa and then brought finished products from the industries. Maybe we could say the trading terms, as you also mentioned, between one good in Africa and another good in Europe was equal. But the moment it shifted from the exchange of goods to exchange of human beings with any other thing, and then the exchange of raw materials with finished products, then the trading terms became unequal. Yeah, so I agree with you. Thank you so much. This is a new perspective I'll begin to share with my students from next year.
Nice one.
Thank you. Can I go on?
Yes, please. I'm waiting. Thank you. Yes.
Okay. So there was already an existing trade in Africa which the Europeans also just joined. It was not like the Europeans came and then began the system of trading in Africa, but they rather fed into the existing structure. So even in Africa, you mentioned Benin, and then Congo and other places. So places like Benin that had human resources to let go because of the emergence of statehood there, because of the wars there, people were vulnerable and were available to be sold. The Europeans, particularly the Portuguese, could buy slaves in Benin and exchange for gold in the Gold Coast, for instance. So the Europeans were not too interested in slaves at that time, but because they had to fit into the existing trade system here, they could buy slaves from one part of Africa, exchange with another African society for the product that they mostly desired at the beginning of their interactions with Africa, such as gold and ivory. So they did not create their own form of trade, but they just tried to fit into the existing ones, taking the product that was available from one place and then exchanging it with another product that is available where they desired at another place in Africa here. So they established their first trading settlement in 1441, and then their first trading depot here in Ghana, in Elmina, in 1482. They initially had thought of gold alone, but by the 15th century, not only a quarter of gold produced in West Africa was sent to Portugal, but also about 10,000 slaves per annum were also bought to work on various Portuguese plantations in Africa, and then some of them to Europe, particularly in Portugal, but not to the Americas yet or the New World yet. It was only from 1530 that slaves were sent from Africa to the New World directly. And by 1620, this number of slaves that began from just 2,000 had increased to various figures and had reached its peak by the 1700s. Please, there is a whole article on the numbers game. I am being very cautious with the numbers I am mentioning here because the academic debate on how many slaves were transported during the whole period has been debated and still inconclusive. So these figures that I am putting up here are just estimations. You may not take them as the all in all. Yes, it's just to give a picture of how gradually the transatlantic slave trade began with minimum numbers and then increased to about 60,000 per annum by the 1700s. Yeah, if I can pause here and ask about the causes of the transatlantic slave trade so that we can talk about the effects and then the abolition of same. So what are some of the things that you have found about the causes of this transatlantic slave trade? Please, are we here?
We are here. We are here, Doc. I'm just wondering, the question that you are raising right now goes into week number 4. So, is this still part of? Is this still no? Yeah. So I have an additional question then. When I thought in preparation for week number 3, I was supposed to focus on, on what you put in the course outline. So do you want us to, actually my question is, how am I supposed to read the course outline? Is it like, are you now teaching us things that we're gonna read about in week number 4?
Yes, I have. You see, the teams are in weeks. But if I want to do one team every week, we don't have 9 weeks. I think we have more than 7 themes. That is why I have decided not to be doing one theme every week. So if in a week we do one, that's fine. If there are other weeks that we can do 2, it will help us to do all the 9 or 10 themes in the 6 or 7 weeks that we have.
Okay. I get it now.
Okay. So is it that I thought, as for the factors that led to the transatlantic slave trade, these are things that we are very conversant with, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes, we are. Maybe it helps if you point out names, because people are unlikely to,
Volunteer.
to volunteer. Yeah.
Oh. Okay, so let me count on you first.
Are you talking about me?
Yes, please.
Okay, sure. So can you repeat the question? It's about the costs of the transatlantic slave trade.
Exactly.
So I think it has a lot to do with what was going on in Western Europe around that time. Western Europe is, as you know, very small. The countries, Spain, Portugal, Britain, Holland, Denmark, these are smaller countries if you look at, how big the countries are on the African continent. So there was a lot of scarcity, there was poverty. People were trying to look for resources elsewhere. And yeah, and the element of trade is a way, of course, to become stronger, to be more powerful, to become richer, to build up your wealth. And they found a lot of trading opportunities on the African continent, where not only a lot of people that they could trade, but also, of course, the resources, the lands, So I think that's a major part of it. Africa, the African continent is, of course, a continent of abundance, and abundance was not the case in Western Europe. So if you then explore the world and you find another continent where there's a lot of abundance, you start setting up a whole trading industry in order to build your own wealth back home and build colonies somewhere else.
So it should have been in legitimate products, which they rightly started. Why slaves? Why did it?
I think also what was happening, of course, yes, there was a lot of turmoil in Europe. Countries were fighting with each other and envy on each other. But because Spain and also Portugal a bit, they did encounter in the Caribbean, in the North Americas, South Americas, a population they could defeat and plunder. They could plunder silver mines, gold mines, salt mines, and they used the indigenous people of that region to work, do forced labor. And then, like you had in your previous slide, there was this discussion with Las Casas, who defended the people from that region, so the indigenous people from the Caribbean and the Americas, saying that maybe the European countries should find other people to work in these forced labor camps in the Caribbean and the, how do you call it, Americas. And that's how they started to bring people, African people, from the continent to the Americas also. And the fact is, like I said, the European countries, there was lots of envy, turmoil, and infighting. They were jealous on the money Spain and Portugal were making in these remote plantation colonies they created. So they did the same thing and started. So, well, first, of course, they captured some of the boats with the gold and silver, and later on they started to imitate the trade and did it 10 times worse, actually. But yes, that's how I have read in the past how this whole transatlantic trade has had its beginning between Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean regions.
All right.
Can I share my thoughts also?
Yes, please.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
I think of this ideology that was also introduced around the 18th, 19th century about races, and maybe that precipitated also the transatlantic slave trade, the ideology of the different races and superiority and inferiority. So according to Kenneth's words and also well, I lost your name. The previous speaker, I think that what made it possible for Christian people to trade in human beings and to persist in that was this foundation of this division on race, that Black people were not humans and that you could treat them like that. Maybe that's also what made it go on and on, because they started on some kind of equal level and it changed. So that's what I'm thinking.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you
Welcome.
all for the wonderful contribution. I think is Veronique?
Yes, I'm here. I'm just mostly listening, but I'm thinking back. I missed the first lesson because I was at a meeting with the indigenous leaders from Suriname, and the
Alright.
way they tell the story is that while there was trade between the Europeans and Africa, the Europeans were already in the Caribbean colonizing, and they were using the indigenous population who were fighting back, and their ships were returning empty to Europe without merchandise because they just couldn't control the indigenous population. And if you look at what we were taught in the first block of this course, there was already the internal slave trade within Africa, and the Europeans just capitalized on that trend in Africa and the developments in the Caribbean with the indigenous people, and started the trade, the transatlantic slave trade. It seems to be an opportunity that presented itself. And then indeed, like Mireia said, it developed, and that Kenneth said, it developed into a system of racism.
Okay, thank you so much. There are very interesting things I have noticed from this, maybe after my comment, and then maybe in the course of this thing, I have seen that two of you have mentioned racism, and it is giving me an impression that it's because of where you are. I think this is a very common phenomenon with you. So it is coming up in some of these things that we are discussing. Usually when we are discussing this matter, I don't think racism does not come up at all. So this is very interesting to note from you, and then maybe going forward, even if it's not today in the course of this, I'll try to appreciate that perspective too, so I can share with my students here in Ghana. Yeah, but these are very, very, very interesting contribution from you. Thank you so much. But you see, Europeans had so-called discovered the New World, and the economic potentials of the New World had to be tapped. Aside from other aspects of the economy, one major thing was the establishment of plantations. And then there is this literature that talks about similar plantations that were established in Sicily and other islands in the Mediterranean during the Middle Ages to produce food to feed the people who were at war. And then Black people were involved in these plantations in the earlier periods before the transatlantic slave trade, before Europeans even explored both Africa and the New World. Africans who were in the Mediterranean were used in these plantations in those islands. So once this economy in America needed slave labor, and then some other group of people did not prove to be capable, the suggestion was made that there are tried and trusted group of people who have done this before elsewhere, who they think they are more capable of doing this. And at that point, Europeans were already making exploits into the coast of Africa. So it was much easier for them to begin to negotiate, to navigate from legitimate products, the exchange of legitimate products such as gold, ivory, and other things, to the exchange of slaves. It will not come so easy. But this is an African economy that was also already trading in slaves among themselves. Slaves were already sold from one society to another, and the African indigenous system made it possible that slaves were bought and sold. But the only thing was that it was very difficult to decipher between a free and a non-free person in the African society because of the color and treatment. If you go into a home, you will not notice the difference between a servant, a pawn, a slave, and even sometimes a child of the slave owner, because they performed similar functions as people who belong to the owner, except that the slave could be bought and sold. So that was the difference. So the Europeans quickly jumped into this existing structure that made available slaves for sale, but they accelerated it by exchanging weaponry, firearms for the slaves in order to accelerate the pace of the acquisition of slaves, because the data had shown that when there is war, there are more slaves than when there is peace. So instead of bringing the African other commodities, let's consciously bring them firearms, which they were interested in also expanding their kingdoms. So Africans needed these firearms to dominate, to control, to be more powerful. And then it coincided with a period where, and once they did this, they found vulnerable people who could become a threat to the society and had to be sold. And then the market was readily available because the Europeans also sought exactly what they wanted to give away. So if you ask what precipitated the transatlantic slave trade, it was different people desiring different things at the same time that coincided. But the most prominent thing is that it is one group of people who engineered it because they had to initiate it because they were consciously in need of the labor in order to do with the to be able to exploit the economy of the new world which they had discovered. So aside from the factors that led to this trade, we've been talking about the effects of the trade, and then they include Africans losing their most valuable resources, and then also include what you have already mentioned as developing the economies of Europe because they took the most valuable resources and then became rich, established the capitalist economy that has led to the perpetual exploitation of the African continent. And then I am sure this is where the racism will come in very strongly as one of the outcome of this transatlantic slave trade. Are there other effects that you can mention before I finally talk about why it was abolished? Do you have any?
I think an important effect is, of course, also, and I think that's also the book written by Las Casas, the destruction of the West Indies, and also the destruction of African culture, of people who were captured and how do you call it? Well, when the human trafficking took place from Africa to the New World. So yeah, there's a number of different effects, and of course, like Mireille and Veronique mentioned, the whole racism of anti-black racism, Afrophobia, got in, was created and is lasting until today. And that's how then also people from the African continent are now regarded less valuable because yes, they even die crossing from Africa to Europe these days and nobody seems to care. Then African lives are considered less important than European lives. And from I think it grew also, and also what is very interesting to note, like you said, it was engineered from European capitals, and also from oral history and from written notes, the lifespan of African people who were moved from Africa to the New World often was not over 10 years. So if somebody from 18 was captured and taken to the New World, with his age of 28 or 30, he was already wasted, dead, and therefore they needed new people to be brought to the New World again. So there were lots of different effects, I think cultural, identity-wise, but also economic effects. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Kenneth. If you look at lasting effects, it's for me one that hits close to home is the loss of identity. If now I go searching for my ancestors, I can go 7 generations back into the white side, just to call it that. And I can find names, places of birth. But for my great grandmother, I only have her name. And her last name is from the man she married, but I can't find her parents. The loss of identity and the loss of your culture. Yes, and racism, I think it was just a system put in place to keep us under control, and we still feel the lasting effects of it today.
Thank you so much.
Can I ask something?
Yes, please.
I'm really struck by the fact that what you already mentioned, Dr. Ali, the point of your perspective, so where you originated from, because my ancestors were just like, I think the others, from the Caribbean partly, and the system was really originated and created there and held in place. And what really strikes me is that from the African selling perspective, it was just negotiation and trade. So is that correct?
Please.
Dr. Ali?
I think you're on mute, Professor.
Okay. Please, what did you just say?
I was struck by the difference in perspective. So
Yes.
from the Caribbean point of view, the system was really embedded and created and engineered to make the differences and divide and conquer on color, on male, female, everything to keep the system in place. And from the African point of view, it was just selling a slave. And this race thing was not leading. Is that correct?
Yes, please. Yes, please. The African was not conscious of a racial
No.
repercussion that we were selling to an inferior or superior race.
No.
It was
No.
just that the African at that point was I think was lured into a business which he did not have so much problem with because he was already doing it. Like I said, you know, buying and selling of slaves is a global phenomenon. Other parts of the world, it happened. In Africa, it was happening. So the African was not conscious of a racial difference, but just that he was taking advantage of a kind of business that he was already very conversant with. But this time, it was even more profitable because those who could sell slaves got firearms that made them expand, became more prosperous and powerful.
Yes.
So if you notice, the kingdoms that emerged after the 16th, 17th century became very, very, very powerful and have outlived those kingdoms that emerged before them. Because they used the advantage that they got, the resources that they got to expand at the expense of their contemporaries. So there was no, but are you saying that from other perspective, right from the beginning, the creating a certain kind of racial inferiority and superiority culture was part of a conscious thing to do from the perspective of the Europeans? I think it's an aftermath, or it's just a repercussion of the incident that was purely fueled by economic motives, or that is not the case?
Are you asking the question? Are you?
Yes,
me? Yes.
I am making a point and then trying to find out whether the slave trade, even from the European perspective, was not purely economic, although it had racial repercussions thereafter. But from the beginning, was the European also very conscious about creating a certain racial superiority and inferiority culture?
Well, maybe I'm biased, but I think yes. I think the answer is yes. I think that at a certain moment there was this consciousness of Christians trading people and moving them from the one continent to the other continent and treating them like beasts, animals. You had to become accountable for that. So I think what I've learned is that a Christian person, a father said, okay, then because the indigenous people were fighting the system and the Europeans and the occupation of the land, and they died because of the diseases. So somebody put this in place. That's what I think. I don't think it's only economy driven. I think it was made possible because of this ideology of superiority and inferiority. And so it's sorry, it's not only about color, it's about the impact of color and the whole theory behind it. But other views?
Well, yeah, I'm going to add, because Marija, I don't think you're completely biased, because it was noticed that the hierarchy of people was, so they did believe that Christian people were superior to non-Christian people, and it was a belief that they started before they even did the whole slave trade. Actually, with the, how do you call it? I think the Spanish Inquisition, they were torturing even Europeans who were Jews because they were not Roman Catholic. So yeah, there was already this hierarchy between human beings, and they extended this hierarchy initially first by enslaving the indigenous people of the New World and exterminating them on a very cruel way, or with also the diseases they brought. Because yeah, one side note, because when people do say the people in the New World were not capable of doing the work, I think that's incorrect, because they were living there already for thousands of years. They know how to do agriculture. They knew how to do mining of gold and silver. So they were very much capable of doing that work, but they were exterminated by overworking them or giving them diseases or killing them in warfare. So when this population of the New World was decimated, the Europeans wanted to continue the practice, and they looked for somebody they thought who was inferior to their cultural system. And later on, they created some myths to support this theory. And it's clear because even though they had also slaves and subordinate people in Europe, they were not sent to work on the plantations, on the work camps in the Americas. They only wanted to have people from the African continent to work there, although everybody could do this work. And so there, yeah, that's definitely a superiority motive in there. One side based on culture, so religion, and other side based on, how you call it, race, because even people who were already Christian or Muslim were still captured and human trafficked to the New World. And then you would say, but they are already in the same belief system, but that was not an excuse. So I think Mireille, you are right, it's not biased. There are clear indications why we would say there has been a racial motive also underlying the human trafficking between Africa and the New World. Short two cents from my side.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I am really enjoying the perspectives. So we talk about the abolition, and then it boils down to one major thing, aside from the so-called religious and humanitarian factors, the economic reorientation in both the New World and Europe did not require as much slave labor as they used to, the Europeans used to want in the New World economy, and the past 100, 200, or 300 years. Now the economy had changed to an industrial one where human labor was less needful, and then there was need for the production of raw materials, and then there was need for the provision of markets for the finished products that will be that will come as a result of the Industrial Revolution. How was it abolished? You know, the major stakeholders, especially Britain, spearheaded this, although it was Denmark who began the process around the 1790s. It was Britain who took the very first initiative to abolish it in 1807, and then went on to practically make sure that ships that were carrying, because it was the biggest naval power in those era, it made sure that it searched ships that still contained slaves and then returned them to their various destinations instead of allowing them into the spaces that they were no more needful. And then eventually all the European countries noticed that colonization was the way to go in order to stop the slave trade as source, could create the environment in Africa here for a reorientation of their economy in a manner that they could continue to exploit the resources to suit the industrialized Europe, rather than continue to do what they used to do by sending slaves to the New World to produce raw materials and then bring them to Europe to produce the finished goods and then sell them in Africa, and then on and on and on. So thank you so much. If you have any addition, if you have any contributions or questions to ask about this, you can do that, please. Hello.
I have no contribution anymore.
No further questions.
Good
All right.
insights. Yes.
Yeah, really great.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Doc. Is there anything else you wanted to share with us?
Yes, the next two themes are Africa under colonial rule, and then the sixth one is decolonization, but it will be very, very difficult. The sixth one is a very broad topic because I look at neocolonialism too under the decolonization. So I don't know whether I can do the two, but all the same, as for Africa under colonial rule, we can make it very snappy so that we can stay within the 6 or 7 weeks and finish all the themes. So you can prepare for Africa under colonial rule, and then nationalist activities in Africa, and then the decolonization processes, and then neocolonialism.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So week number 5 and week number 6. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay, that is fine. And where does your paper fit in? You've sent us earlier today.
Honestly, my paper is just in between the two extremes of, and these were just notes that I created, which I haven't shared in the past 6 years or so. They were notes that I did on economic and social networks, political developments in Africa, European advent, Africa and the colonial rule, and then nationalist activities and decolonization in Africa. I did not do notes on neocolonialism and all the other themes that follow after neocolonialism.
Okay, but so we can read it anytime. Yeah.
Yes, anytime. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you too. And for our fellow students, if you haven't filled in the poll, please do so, because we want to make a decision about our study group. If you want to, you know, have a study group so that we can also learn with each other during the days that we don't meet the lecturer. So kindly fill in what is your best day. Then we can start our study group, maybe even this week already.
Dank u wel, Lisbeth. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you too. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye bye.